Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. DarXnights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. In the still darkness of a June night in 1912, in the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, something happened that would scar the soul of the town forever. 8 people, 6 of them children, were murdered in their sleep. The weapon? An axe. The motive? Unknown. The killer? Never found. What followed were decades of rumors, hauntings, and whispers of something darker than a man lurking in the shadows. Before we begin, if you're listening in bed, make sure your doors are locked, your mirrors are covered, and no one else is hiding in your house. Because once you hear what happened in Villisca, you may never sleep peacefully again. You're listening to Mr. DarXnights, and this is one of the most disturbing true crime stories that still haunts the heart of America. Villisca, Iowa, in the early 1900s, was the kind of place where bad things weren't supposed to happen. Nestled in the rolling plains of the Midwest, it was small, quiet, and predictable. The population hovered around 2,000, mostly hardworking families, farmers, and local shopkeepers. There were churches on every corner, front porches lined with flower pots, and kids who played in the streets until the sun dipped below the fields. It was the epitome of safe. People didn't lock their doors at night, and gossip traveled faster than any train. Nothing much ever changed in Villisca, and for most of the residents, that was exactly how they liked it. The community was tight-knit, woven together by decades of familiarity. Everyone knew everyone, and if they didn't know you personally, they knew someone who did. Neighbors watched each other's children. They brought casseroles to homes during times of grief. Families walked to church together on Sundays. People said good morning when they passed on the street. There was no room for secrets in a town like Villisca, until June of 1912, when the unthinkable happened and the illusion of safety shattered forever. In the spring and early summer of that year, Villisca was bustling with local events. The church was organizing children's plays and picnics. The business district was seeing growth thanks to the arrival of electricity and new rail lines connecting nearby towns. Josiah Moore, one of Villisca's most respected businessmen, was contributing to that growth. He owned a franchise of the John Deere Company and was known for his honesty, discipline, and devotion to his family. His wife Sarah was equally well regarded, quiet, devout, and active in the church. Their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were seen as polite, energetic, and kind. They lived in a white frame house on East 2nd Street, a modest but cozy home with a large front porch, a tidy garden, and a warm, inviting atmosphere. It was the kind of house people walked by and smiled at. The kind of house where laughter could be heard from the windows in the evenings. No one ever imagined it would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. The Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, were friends of the Moore children. They belonged to another respected Villisca family and often visited the Moore house for sleepovers or playdates. On Sunday, June 9, 1912, the Moore family had attended a local church function. They were joined by Lena and Ina, who ended up spending the night. There was nothing unusual about it. The evening had been filled with performances, community pride, and the comforting routine of a summer night in a small town. As they walked home under the glow of gas lamps, no one knew they were marching straight into the pages of history. By the next morning, Villisca would change. The comfort of routine would give way to disbelief, fear, and suspicion. A nightmare had begun to unfold, and it would leave a permanent scar on the soul of the town. The town's transformation didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just concern. A neighbor noticed that the Moores hadn't come out to do chores. Milk delivery was left untouched. The house was eerily still. But even then, no one thought of murder. Not in Villisca. Not in a place like this. But by mid-morning, after neighbors began knocking and phones rang without answer, a sense of unease crept in. It was subtle at first, an edge in voices, glances exchanged between residents. As if everyone suddenly sensed that something wasn't quite right. What lay behind the closed doors of the Moore house would shatter every illusion Villisca had about its own innocence. It would mark the beginning of endless theories, rumors, and whispers. The town would never feel the same again. The warmth, the predictability, the comforting rhythm of daily life, it all ended that day. And no matter how many years passed, no matter how many crops grew, children were born, or seasons changed, the name Villisca would never again be uttered without a shadow behind it. This wasn't just the story of a brutal crime. It was the death of safety. The dismantling of everything a town thought it knew about itself. After the murders, Villisca became a name that meant something else, something grim, something ghostly. People would speak of it in hushed tones, pass it by on road trips with a glance out the window, or search it online late at night, wondering how such evil could come to a place that once felt like paradise. And yet, that's what made it even more terrifying. Because Villisca was perfect. Until it wasn't. The Moore family was everything a small-town American household in the early 1900s was expected to be: honest, hardworking, devout, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of community life. Josiah B. Moore, the patriarch, was a successful businessman and a known figure throughout Villisca. He had built a solid reputation through years of dedication to his work, his family, and his church. As a prominent dealer for the John Deere Company, Josiah had earned the trust of farmers and townsfolk alike, not only through his business acumen but also through his reliable, no-nonsense character. People respected him. They trusted him. His name was synonymous with integrity, and his presence in the community felt steady and unwavering. Sarah Montgomery Moore, Josiah's wife, mirrored his reputation in her own way. She was a woman of strong moral values, active in church organizations, and known for her quiet compassion and firm sense of duty. She dedicated herself fully to her home and children while maintaining an influential role within the Presbyterian Church. Her leadership in the local Children's Day programs and the church's social functions was widely admired. She was dependable, organized, and always willing to help a neighbor or friend in need. Their family life reflected a strong foundation of faith, routine, and purpose. The couple had 4 children: Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, each loved deeply and raised with discipline and warmth. Herman, the eldest, was 11 years old. He was beginning to adopt some of his father's seriousness and sense of responsibility. Catherine, aged 10, had a quiet, observant nature and was particularly close to her mother. Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5, were the youngest and often inseparable in their playful energy. To those who knew them, the Moore children were polite, cheerful, and well-behaved. They were the kind of children who addressed adults with respect, attended Sunday school without complaint, and always said please and thank you. The Moore home was modest but comfortable, a white, 2-story frame house on East 2nd Street. It stood as a physical embodiment of the family's life, neat, humble, and filled with love. The interior was warm and lived in, with the everyday clutter of childhood toys, cooking utensils, and family belongings arranged in an orderly, familiar manner. The home had no extravagant features, but it didn't need them. Its beauty came from the life that pulsed within its walls, a routine built on shared meals, evening prayers, and moments of quiet joy. One of the Moore family's most cherished values was hospitality. Their home was open to others, especially the children's friends. It wasn't uncommon for neighborhood kids to visit, to spend time playing in the yard, or even sleep over during special occasions. The Moore family welcomed guests with ease, extending their warmth and trust to others in the community. This generosity, while admirable, would later be remembered with a chilling sadness. It was precisely this openness that allowed 2 young guests to be present in the home the night tragedy struck. The Stillinger sisters, Lena, 12, and Ina, 8, were daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, another well-regarded family from the nearby area. Lena and Ina had planned to attend the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church that Sunday, and since it was already late when the event concluded, they accepted an invitation to spend the night at the Moore home. It wasn't a big deal, just another friendly gesture between trusted families. A simple sleepover. Nothing out of the ordinary. That Sunday was filled with joy and excitement for the Moore household. The Children's Day program had gone well, with Sarah helping organize the event and the children participating in the recitations and hymns. The family returned home that evening with the 2 Stillinger girls, likely filled with the kind of post-event tiredness and contentment that comes after a full day. The children were likely chattering about their performances, laughing at inside jokes, and looking forward to sleeping late the next morning. They would have climbed into their beds with no sense of fear, no inkling that anything was wrong. In that moment, the Moore house was what it had always been, a sanctuary. But the events that would soon unfold would erase that sanctuary forever. The Moore family, along with their 2 young guests, would never wake up from that night. The quiet strength Josiah had spent years building would vanish in a moment. The routine Sarah had lovingly instilled would be shattered. And the voices of 6 children, once full of laughter and life, would be silenced by the blunt force of something inhuman. The very identity of the Moore family, so central to Villisca's sense of security, would be violently stripped away, leaving behind a legacy not of prosperity or goodness, but of unrelenting mystery and horror. In the aftermath, people would struggle to comprehend how such an event could occur to a family like the Moores. They were not involved in any known conflicts, had no enemies, and lived by the very principles their community celebrated. There was no explanation. No justice. No closure. All that remained was a haunting absence, of a family that had once embodied everything Villisca believed in, now remembered only as the victims of one of America's most brutal, unsolved crimes. The morning of June 10, 1912, began with an absence that went unnoticed for only a short time. In a town as tightly knit as Villisca, Iowa, the rhythm of daily life was predictable, almost ritualistic. Neighbors were used to seeing familiar faces at the same times each day. Routines weren't just habits, they were benchmarks for a community that prided itself on order and accountability. So when the Moore household remained uncharacteristically still on that Monday morning, it quickly began to draw quiet concern. Mary Peckham, the Moores' next-door neighbor, found the silence unusual. Sarah Moore was typically up early, attending to chores and checking in with the neighbors as part of her morning routine. The Moore children would normally be seen playing or doing small tasks around the yard. But on this morning, there was no sign of activity. The curtains remained drawn. No voices, no movement, no clatter of dishes or footsteps creaking across wooden floors. Only silence, as if the house itself had stopped breathing. As time passed, Mary grew increasingly uneasy. She attempted to knock and call out but received no response. Her concern shifted from inconvenience to dread. The milk delivery was still on the porch, untouched. The house remained locked. With a growing sense that something was wrong, she contacted Josiah Moore's brother, Ross Moore, and asked him to come and check on the family. Ross arrived around 8:30 a.m. with his own set of house keys. He, too, sensed the unnatural stillness of the house and noted the lack of response as he called inside. He entered through the back door and made his way into the parlor. What he discovered in the guest bedroom defied understanding. Without shouting or alarming others, he returned outside and instructed Mary to contact the authorities. He confirmed what would become one of the most gruesome discoveries in American crime history: 8 people, including 6 children, brutally murdered while they slept. The response from the authorities was swift, but by the time the police arrived, the damage to the crime scene had already begun. Word spread quickly through the town. Before officers could fully secure the house, townspeople, driven by curiosity and horror, had already begun to gather. Some entered the home, stepping into the very rooms where the murders had taken place. Evidence was compromised within minutes, fingerprints smudged, footprints covered, objects moved or mishandled. The Villisca Police Department, unprepared for a crime of this magnitude, struggled to impose order. The home, meant to be preserved as a sacred and horrific scene, became overwhelmed by panic, speculation, and the chaotic shuffle of horrified onlookers. The local coroner, along with the county doctor, began the grim task of examining the victims. Each had been bludgeoned to death with an axe, most likely Josiah Moore's own tool, which had been left behind in the house. The wounds were brutal. The bodies showed signs of having been attacked while they slept, with most showing no defensive injuries. Pillows, bedclothes, and garments had been used to cover the faces of the victims. Blood spattered the walls and ceilings, marking the sheer violence of the act. The authorities concluded that the murders had likely occurred between midnight and 5 a.m. There were signs that the killer had stayed in the house for some time afterward. Lamps were found with the chimneys removed and the wicks bent, indicating an attempt to keep the light dim. Food was found uneaten in the kitchen, suggesting the killer had prepared a meal after the murders. Covered mirrors and windows implied a ritualistic or psychological element, perhaps shame, fear of reflection, or a symbolic effort to hide the crime from divine judgment. Josiah Moore received the most severe injuries, his head crushed to the point of disfigurement. Sarah and the children followed, each victim silenced with ruthless efficiency. In the guest room, Lena Stillinger was found in a position that suggested she may have awakened before the killer struck. A defensive wound and slight displacement of her body indicated she may have struggled, if only briefly. Her younger sister, Ina, was beside her, similarly covered and lifeless. The community began to react in waves: shock, then fear, then confusion. The idea that someone could commit such an atrocity in a home like the Moores, in a town like Villisca, seemed incomprehensible. Families that had never before locked their doors now did so without question. Children were kept home. Neighbors who once trusted each other implicitly now glanced sideways, unsure of who could have been capable of such a crime. The air was heavy with suspicion and dread, and the town began to lose its innocence minute by minute. Authorities scrambled to identify suspects, but leads were scarce. The killer had left no clear trail. There was no evidence of forced entry. No valuables had been stolen. No personal messages or threats had been sent beforehand. It was as if someone, or something, had entered the house silently, killed without hesitation, and disappeared into the darkness without a trace. June 10, 1912, would go down not only as the darkest day in Villisca's history, but also as the beginning of a mystery that would confound law enforcement, provoke generations of theories, and embed itself permanently in America's legacy of unsolved horrors. As investigators began combing through the Moore residence, the gravity of what had transpired became increasingly clear, and more unsettling with each observation. Though the crime itself was plainly horrific, it was the killer's behavior and choices afterward that introduced a disturbing layer of psychological complexity. What might have initially appeared to be a moment of impulsive violence began to resemble something far more calculated, ritualistic, and chilling. One of the first baffling clues was the careful covering of the victims. Each face had been concealed using either clothing or bed linens, and in some cases, personal items were draped over mirrors throughout the house. Windows had been covered, some with pieces of fabric, others with clothing from dresser drawers. It appeared that the killer had gone to great lengths to obscure faces, reflections, and possibly their own view of the aftermath. While it could have been interpreted as shame, remorse, or superstition, it left investigators confused. Most killers fled quickly. This one lingered, long enough to rearrange the crime scene with deliberate purpose. Adding to the mystery was the discovery of a kerosene lamp in each bedroom. The chimneys had been removed, the wicks bent, and the light dimmed to a near flicker. It was evident the killer had moved from room to room under the lowest possible visibility, careful not to alert anyone to their presence while methodically carrying out the attacks. Each body bore signs of repeated blows from the blunt end of the axe. The damage was excessive, far beyond what would have been necessary to kill. It suggested rage, intimate, relentless, and deeply personal. Yet none of the victims had any known enemies. No one in town had anything but kind words to say about the Moores or the Stillinger sisters. Investigators noted that the axe, believed to be the murder weapon, had been left behind. It belonged to Josiah and had been taken from his own backyard. After the murders, it was found leaning against the wall in the guest room, coated in blood and hair. The presence of the axe at the scene further suggested that the crime had been premeditated in some respects, yet opportunistic in others. It raised troubling possibilities. Was the killer someone who knew the family's habits? Someone who knew where tools were kept? Or someone who simply happened upon the weapon and used it with terrifying precision? Strangely, a plate of uneaten food was found in the kitchen, as well as a bowl of bloody water. It was theorized that the killer had washed their hands after the murders, another sign that they remained in the house long after the crimes were committed. More bizarre still was the presence of a slab of bacon, weighing nearly 2 pounds, left wrapped in a cloth near the axe. There was no logical explanation for it. Some speculated it had ritualistic significance. Others believed it might have been intended as bait for a dog or a distraction for someone in the house. But no concrete reason was ever determined. It was a detail that haunted investigators, useless, strange, and ultimately inexplicable. Law enforcement, both local and brought in from nearby counties, were immediately overwhelmed. The town had no experience with homicides of this nature. The contaminated crime scene made collecting proper evidence nearly impossible. Still, they documented what they could and began interviewing anyone who might offer a lead. They asked about strangers in town, drifters seen near the train depot, or anyone who may have had a grudge against Josiah Moore. Rumors ran wild. Whispers turned into accusations, and suspicion spread like a virus. No one felt safe. No one could explain why 8 innocent people had been murdered in their sleep without the killer leaving behind even a footprint to follow. The strange elements at the crime scene led some to believe the murders weren't the work of a typical criminal. Some pointed to madness, an unknown lunatic passing through. Others suggested religious or cult connections, citing the covered mirrors and methodical nature of the killings. And a few began to speak more quietly, fearful of what the truth might imply, that this wasn't random, that perhaps the person responsible wasn't some outsider, but someone close, someone familiar. As the days wore on and no arrests were made, public frustration grew. With no clear suspect and little evidence to rely on, theories began to multiply. Some were based on potential motives, jealousy, business rivalry, revenge. Others focused on the scene itself, interpreting the details through the lens of psychology, superstition, or desperation. Theories involved traveling serial killers, religious fanatics, disgruntled employees, and mentally unstable relatives. None could be proven. Each one, however, only deepened the sense of unease that now hung over Villisca like a permanent fog. There were simply too many contradictions. A brutal mass killing, but with signs of care. A blood-soaked rampage, yet no obvious motive. A murder weapon left behind, yet no physical evidence linking a suspect. Everything about the crime scene felt off, too chaotic to be methodical, too methodical to be random. The killer had come and gone without being seen, leaving behind a house filled not only with horror, but with questions that would never find answers. In 1912, forensic science was still in its infancy, especially in small towns like Villisca, Iowa. The medical examination of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters would reflect both the rudimentary tools available at the time and the limitations of contemporary investigative procedures. What might today be solved through DNA evidence, trace analysis, or advanced crime scene reconstruction was then dependent on visual observation, interviews, and basic pathology. Still, what was discovered through the autopsies offered chilling insight into the brutal nature of the crime, and reinforced the conclusion that the killer had acted with calculated savagery. Dr. Lindquist, the county coroner, led the examination of the 8 victims. His findings were disturbing and consistent. All of the victims had suffered massive head trauma, with their skulls crushed by repeated blows from the blunt end of the axe. In Josiah Moore's case, it was later concluded that he had received the greatest number of blows, so many, in fact, that his facial features were completely obliterated. The force required to cause such destruction was extreme and indicated that the killer had not merely intended to kill, but to utterly destroy. Sarah Moore's injuries were also significant, though slightly fewer than her husband's. The children, including the Stillinger sisters, were each bludgeoned in their beds, most with similar patterns of injury, multiple blows to the head, wounds that were fatal in the first strikes but followed by further violence even after death. The killer had clearly moved through the house with an intentional sequence, beginning with Josiah and Sarah's bedroom before moving to the children's rooms and then finally to the guest room where Lena and Ina Stillinger were sleeping. The idea that the victims had been asleep when attacked was supported by the absence of defensive wounds. None of the children, and neither Josiah nor Sarah, showed signs of having fought back. It was as if death had come in complete silence, catching each victim in their most vulnerable moment. The exception was Lena Stillinger. Her body was found in a slightly different position, her nightgown drawn up and a minor wound on her arm suggesting she may have awakened and possibly moved before being struck. There was initial speculation that she may have been the only one to witness the killer in the moment of attack. Some of the earliest media reports and local gossip began to hint at possible sexual motives due to Lena's position, though the coroner found no physical evidence of assault. Regardless, her partial disarray and unique positioning disturbed the investigators and led to further speculation about the killer's psychological state. Why would one victim be treated differently? Was it symbolic, or the result of something more predatory? The positioning of the bodies, the precision of the blows, and the uniformity of the murder method all suggested the work of someone with a grim familiarity with violence. But what troubled the coroner and local officials most was not only the brutality, it was the time and patience the killer had exhibited. The murders had likely taken place over an extended period. Some estimates suggested the killer could have spent over an hour inside the house, committing the crimes and staging the aftermath without ever being disturbed. The level of confidence required for such an act was chilling. Compounding the problem for the investigators was the sheer number of people who had trampled through the home before the coroner even arrived. After the bodies were discovered, dozens of townspeople entered the house out of morbid curiosity. Some even touched the victims or picked up items in the rooms. This contamination rendered any forensic hope of tracking the killer nearly impossible. Fingerprint collection was a developing science, but the scene had been so heavily disturbed that reliable prints could not be obtained. And in an era before DNA, hair analysis, or blood typing, there was little else that could be used to draw scientific conclusions. At the time, there were no professional crime scene photographers on hand. A few grainy photographs were taken by local press, but they did little to preserve the details necessary for a proper forensic review. Lighting was poor, measurement protocols were non-existent, and evidence bags had not yet become a common part of procedure. Most of the documentation was done by hand, in notebooks, or through sworn testimonies. This lack of rigor allowed key pieces of evidence, footprints, potential fibers, biological material, to be lost or corrupted before they could ever be analyzed. The autopsy report was conclusive only in what had occurred, not who had done it, or why. The killer had used a single weapon, moved through the house in a chillingly logical manner, and exerted force far beyond what was necessary to kill. Every aspect of the attack suggested intent. But the forensics of 1912 could go no further than describing the result of the killer's actions. The identity, motive, and presence of the murderer remained intangible, a shadow cast over Villisca that no microscope or medical exam could illuminate. With the scientific limitation so stark, the investigation was forced to rely on human observation, theory, and confession, tools far more susceptible to error, bias, and misdirection. And as days passed, with no solid leads, the question loomed larger: would this crime forever remain unsolved not just because of its mystery, but because the era simply lacked the means to ever understand it? In the days and weeks following the Villisca axe murders, fear began to morph into obsession. Without a clear suspect or motive, the townspeople, and soon the nation, found themselves wrapped in speculation, theory, and suspicion. The case was no longer just a tragedy. It became an enigma, a puzzle that refused to resolve itself. As the press descended upon Villisca and investigators scrambled for answers, a list of potential suspects began to form. Each name carried its own weight of possibility, but none came with the evidence needed for a conviction. One of the earliest and most discussed suspects was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher known for his erratic behavior and troubled past. Kelly had been in Villisca the night of the murders and had attended the Sunday evening church service where the Moore children had performed. What made him immediately suspicious was his sudden departure early the next morning and his disturbing history. He was known to have suffered from mental health issues, including auditory hallucinations and sexual deviance. He had once been accused of sending obscene letters and reportedly spied on women while they dressed. Though he seemed unstable, it was his later confession, years after the murders, that drew national attention. Kelly confessed during a period of intense questioning but later recanted. His confession was inconsistent, lacking key details only the killer would know. Many believed it had been coerced or was the product of his unstable mental state. When brought to trial in 1917, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. A second trial resulted in his acquittal. Despite public fascination with his connection to the case, no physical evidence ever tied Kelly to the scene. He faded into obscurity, leaving behind only more questions. Another major theory focused on business rivalry. Josiah Moore had once worked for Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and state senator. The relationship between the two men had reportedly turned sour when Moore left Jones's company to start his own business, taking valuable clients with him. This tension led some to suspect that Jones may have hired someone to eliminate Moore in an act of revenge. The most frequently cited figure in this theory was William Mansfield, a known criminal and suspected serial killer who had been linked to other axe murders across the country. Mansfield was believed to be connected to similar family murders in Illinois and Kansas, all involving the use of an axe, victims killed in their sleep, covered mirrors, and undisturbed valuables. The similarities were uncanny. In 1916, Mansfield was arrested and investigated in relation to the Villisca murders. However, he was later released after providing alibis and passing a lie detector test, a primitive and controversial tool at the time. While some believed his release was premature or politically motivated, others thought the match was too convenient. Nothing ever conclusively tied Mansfield to Villisca, and no charges stuck. A third theory revolved around the idea of a wandering killer, possibly a transient or vagrant, who moved from town to town, committing murders with a similar modus operandi. Several axe murders occurred in the Midwest around the same time as the Villisca crime, including in Colorado Springs, Ellsworth, and Paula. In nearly all cases, entire families were slain in their beds, the weapon was an axe found at the scene, and the attacks bore signs of quiet planning and extreme violence. Some investigators speculated a connection between these killings, believing a single individual could have been responsible. This theory, though plausible, offered no name, no face, and no concrete suspect, only a pattern that left communities grasping for answers. As time passed, more names surfaced, each carrying a trail of gossip, circumstantial evidence, or alleged confessions. A local man with known animosity toward the Moore family. A transient spotted by the train depot near the house that night. A mentally ill farmer with a violent past. For every theory, there was a counter-theory, for every suspect, a lack of proof. The deeper authorities looked, the murkier things became. There was no shortage of suspicion, but suspicion alone wasn't justice. The investigation soon began to suffer under the weight of its own complexity. Political rivalries, personal vendettas, and the media circus all clouded the process. Rumors spread faster than facts. Witnesses contradicted each other. Potential leads were lost in the confusion. What could have been a focused investigation slowly unraveled into chaos and frustration. The case grew cold not for lack of interest, but for lack of direction. As the years passed, the names associated with the Villisca axe murders continued to surface in books, documentaries, and amateur investigations. Yet none of them ever fit perfectly. Either they lacked opportunity, motive, mental capacity, or access. Some were too obvious. Others were too strange. All shared one tragic similarity: no clear proof, no definitive answers, no justice. In a case marked by extremes, the innocence of the victims, the brutality of the crime, the eerie staging of the scene, it was perhaps fitting that the truth itself would remain just out of reach. Theories would remain just that, stories built on fear, speculation, and the human need to make sense of the senseless. The Villisca axe murders were more than a crime, they were a wound that split a community wide open. Before the night of June 9, 1912, Villisca had been a quiet, church-going town nestled in the heart of Iowa. Its people prided themselves on close ties, strong values, and an unshakable sense of safety. But after the brutal slaying of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters, that illusion was shattered. The violence didn't just claim 8 lives, it erased the town's innocence and left behind a psychological scar that would never fully heal. In the days that followed the murders, Villisca transformed into a place of paranoia and mistrust. Neighbors who once left doors unlocked began bolting them shut. Curtains stayed drawn. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Even lifelong residents found themselves questioned by law enforcement or whispered about by friends. Everyone wanted answers, and in the absence of facts, fear filled the vacuum. It was as if evil had crept in silently one night and taken up permanent residence. Children no longer played freely in the streets. Families who once gathered together in the evenings now avoided socializing after sundown. Church services became more crowded, not from devotion, but from desperation. People sought meaning, comfort, and some explanation for what had occurred. But no amount of prayer or scripture could explain the horror that had unfolded within the Moore home. The schools, too, felt the impact. Teachers and classmates who had known the Moore children and the Stillinger sisters were traumatized. Desks sat empty. Hallways echoed with the silence of grief. Grief counselors, unheard of at the time, were not available. Children processed their pain in silence or through anxious behavior, and parents were left to navigate how to speak of murder in a world where such topics were never supposed to touch small-town life. Commerce and business in Villisca suffered in the wake of the tragedy. The town became infamous, not for its community spirit or agricultural success, but as the place where an entire family was butchered in their sleep. Travelers avoided it. Journalists exploited it. Real estate values dropped. Some families quietly relocated, unable to bear the stigma or the constant reminders. Others stayed but changed, hardened by fear, distrustful of the people around them, never quite able to look at their town the same way again. The Moore house itself became a source of morbid fascination. Though the family was buried with great sorrow and respect, the house where they had died remained a haunting presence in Villisca. Some believed it cursed. Others thought it haunted. A few tried to avoid even walking past it, while some ghoulishly sought to visit. The line between mourning and macabre began to blur, especially as the case remained unsolved. Over time, whispers grew about strange occurrences, footsteps heard when no one was there, lights flickering, children's laughter in the dead of night. Whether these tales were born from truth, grief, or imagination, they took root and became part of the town's folklore. The impact extended to law enforcement and government, as well. The failure to solve the case sparked accusations of incompetence, cover-ups, and corruption. Local officials were overwhelmed, and as state investigators and private detectives joined the fray, jurisdictional disputes and conflicting egos took precedence over cooperation. The trust that townspeople once placed in their authorities began to erode. If the police couldn't protect the most respected family in Villisca, who could they protect? Even within churches, cracks formed. The idea that a man of God, Reverend George Kelly, could be suspected of such a heinous act shook many believers to their core. It raised uncomfortable questions about morality, trust, and evil. Religious leaders struggled to provide comfort, unsure themselves of what message to deliver in such darkness. Was this a test of faith? A punishment? Or simply the work of a monstrous mind beyond human understanding? Over time, Villisca tried to heal, but the scars remained. Decades later, those who had lived through the murder would recall it not just as a tragedy, but as the moment their childhoods ended, their community changed, and their certainty about the world collapsed. It wasn't just a crime, it was a turning point. The case would become the subject of books, documentaries, podcasts, and paranormal investigations. Outsiders would continue to peer into Villisca, searching for answers the town had long since stopped expecting. But for the residents, especially those descended from people who lived through the aftermath, the pain remained deeply personal. Behind every theory and headline was a family forever broken, a house forever changed, and a town that had become a symbol of mystery and dread. Generations later, Villisca remains a place remembered for what happened one summer night over a century ago. The community has carried the weight of that night into modern times, not by choice, but because there's no way to untangle its identity from the horror of that unsolved crime. No justice, no closure. Just questions, legends, and the lingering sense that evil, once invited in, never fully leaves. Among the most chilling elements of the Villisca axe murders were not only the brutal killings themselves, but the unnerving details the killer left behind. These details painted a picture not just of violence, but of methodical, almost ritualistic behavior. The scene was not chaotic or hurried, it was coldly calculated. The more investigators looked, the more it became clear that the person responsible had taken their time and had been deeply deliberate in every move. One of the first things noticed by those who entered the home was how the mirrors had been covered with cloths and clothing. Every reflective surface, including glass cabinets and dressers, had been deliberately obscured. This was not a rushed or careless act. The killer had gone room to room, covering anything that would reflect an image. In some belief systems and superstitions, this is done to prevent spirits of the dead from becoming trapped in mirrors. Others interpret it as an attempt to avoid confronting one's own image after committing murder. Regardless of motive, the act was unsettling and rare in crime scenes, particularly in small-town America during that era. All of the window shades were pulled down, and in places where they didn't reach the bottom of the windows, additional clothing had been used to block out any visibility. It was as if the killer wanted complete privacy during the act, but also wanted to make sure no one outside would know what had occurred until morning. The conscious effort to ensure darkness and concealment signaled a level of confidence that was both eerie and unusual. Whoever committed the murders had no apparent fear of being caught in the act. Perhaps most disturbing was the use of a piece of raw bacon. Investigators found a slab of uncooked bacon wrapped in a dishcloth and left on the floor in the downstairs guest room, near where the Stillinger girls had been killed. The bacon was not part of any known ritual, nor was it used as a weapon or tool. Its presence seemed symbolic or personal. Some theorized that it pointed to a killer with severe psychological disturbances, possibly a sexual fetish or some form of psychosis. Others believed it might have been used to bait animals or distract attention. But in truth, no one ever figured out why it was there. Its strangeness added to the surreal horror of the entire case. A bowl of bloody water was found in the kitchen. It appeared that the killer had used the sink to wash up before leaving. Blood-stained towels were found nearby, suggesting that some attempt had been made to clean themselves off. This small act, rinsing off after such carnage, indicated again that the killer had time and calmness. It was not the behavior of someone panicking after a murder. It was someone in control, someone who wanted to exit quietly and without leaving a trail. The murder weapon itself, an axe belonging to Josiah Moore, had been left in the guest room. It was partially cleaned but still stained with blood and hair. The killer had taken it from the house and then returned it there after the killings, placing it in a way that made it clear it was no longer needed. There was no sign of a struggle anywhere in the house, no overturned furniture, no dragged bodies. It was a silent massacre. The house itself remained almost peaceful in appearance, making the horror inside all the more jarring to those who walked in expecting a burglary or fire and instead found death. Another haunting element was the timeline. Based on the state of the bodies and the clock that had stopped due to a broken pendulum likely disturbed during the killings, it was believed that the murders occurred sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. This would mean the killer had waited until the house was deeply quiet before striking. He may have been inside the house already, possibly hiding in the attic or a closet. Dusty shoe prints found in the attic lent some weight to this theory, though nothing could be confirmed. If true, the killer had spent hours inside the home before beginning the slaughter. That kind of patience and psychological control was deeply unnerving. Equally grim was the realization that the killer might have watched the Moore family for days leading up to the murders. He may have known their habits, their routines, and how to avoid detection. The house was near the center of town, close to other homes. That the murders occurred without a single neighbor hearing anything was both frightening and baffling. The killer had moved with ghost-like silence, committing an act of horrific violence in near-perfect stealth. The small town was never meant for this kind of evil. The people of Villisca lived in a world of unlocked doors and neighborly trust. But the details left behind after the murders, the mirrors, the bacon, the bowl of blood, the covered windows, told a different story. They suggested a mind not only capable of violence, but of deep, chilling thought. A mind that wanted control, secrecy, and perhaps something more twisted, ritual, dominance, or even satisfaction. To this day, these remnants of the crime scene continue to fuel theories and nightmares. They weren't just leftovers from a violent act, they were messages from the killer, whether intentional or not. Clues that no one ever fully understood. And in their silence, they speak volumes. The Villisca axe murders might have begun as a local tragedy, but they quickly became a national obsession. In an era where newspapers were the primary source of information and sensationalism often drove circulation, the details of the crime provided fertile ground for explosive headlines and lurid storytelling. Reporters descended on Villisca from across the country, and what followed was a media storm unlike anything the quiet Iowa town had ever experienced. The early 1900s were a time when true crime stories were printed with theatrical flair. Journalism leaned heavily on the dramatic, often blurring the line between fact and fiction to captivate readers. The Villisca murders offered everything that could sell newspapers: an entire family slaughtered in their home, young children among the dead, a weapon left behind, and no immediate suspect. The mysterious elements, combined with the gruesomeness of the act, allowed editors to push fear and intrigue with equal intensity. Headlines screamed of a midnight massacre and an unholy butcher. Newspapers speculated wildly about motives, jealousy, revenge, insanity, even satanic ritual. Though no such evidence existed to support the more outlandish theories, the press printed them anyway. Readers were gripped, not just by the horror of the act, but by the notion that such evil could infiltrate a town so ordinary and untouched by crime. It was precisely that contrast, the peaceful setting versus the unimaginable crime, that made the story so magnetic. Journalists hounded local residents for details, rumors, and theories. Families who had known the Moores were suddenly confronted by strangers asking invasive questions. People who had nothing to do with the crime found their names dragged into articles simply because they had been nearby, or had spoken to someone who had seen something vaguely unusual. This intense media presence created an atmosphere of constant anxiety and social suspicion. Neighbors began to view each other with unease, especially when the papers hinted that the killer might have been someone from within the town. Some publications went so far as to describe the crime scene in disturbing detail. They printed accounts of how the victims were found, the position of their bodies, and even postulated about the killer's mindset. In the absence of modern journalistic ethics or concern for the families involved, nothing was off limits. The graphic nature of the reporting added fuel to public fear and made the crime feel more immediate and real, even to those hundreds of miles away. Within weeks, the Villisca Axe murders had become a fixture in American households. The story spread from coast to coast, with editorials calling for swift justice and sensational pieces imagining the killer's profile. The tragedy was no longer a local nightmare. It had become a part of national consciousness, a topic of hushed discussion in parlors and dinner tables far from Iowa. For many Americans, it was the first time they had to confront the idea that true evil could strike without warning, even in the most wholesome places. The media also amplified the failures of the investigation. When law enforcement stumbled or provided conflicting reports, newspapers were quick to pounce. They criticized the lack of coordination, the contamination of the crime scene by curious townsfolk, and the mishandling of potential leads. This scrutiny further undermined public confidence in the authorities' ability to solve the crime. Rather than bringing the community together, the constant press coverage seemed to fracture it even more. Sensationalistic coverage also sparked a wave of amateur detectives, conspiracy theorists, and opportunists. Some people claimed to have dreamed about the killer. Others wrote letters to the police offering psychic visions or spiritual guidance. A few claimed to have heard confessions, seen ghosts, or discovered secret diaries. These stories found their way into newspapers, feeding an already boiling pot of speculation. While some theories were benign, others were damaging, leading to public accusations and ruined reputations, all without evidence. The press didn't limit itself to crime coverage. Some writers turned their attention to the supposed paranormal aspects of the case. They interviewed locals who spoke of strange noises, ghost sightings, and a feeling of unease that hung over the Moore house. Tales of haunting soon became part of the larger narrative. The idea that the house might be cursed or inhabited by restless spirits added a sensational layer to an already overwhelming public fascination. Despite the passage of time, the media's role in shaping the Villisca narrative remained significant. The way the crime was reported influenced how it was remembered. Even decades later, references to the murders often rely on the dramatic language and imagery first crafted by journalists in 1912. The murder house became not just a location of tragedy, but a cultural artifact, symbolic of a lost innocence and a mystery that refused resolution. While the intense press attention helped to keep the case in public awareness, it also contributed to its confusion. Key facts were lost in a sea of speculation. Witness accounts were twisted or misrepresented. Hysteria often overshadowed logic. In the quest for headlines, the truth became harder to find. Ultimately, the media transformed the Villisca Axe murders from a horrific but isolated event into one of the most enduring unsolved crimes in American history. And as with many stories sensationalized by the press, the line between fact and legend blurred, leaving behind a tale that continues to haunt, disturb, and mystify more than a century later. As investigators scrambled for answers in the wake of the Villisca Axe murders, suspicion eventually settled on a most unlikely suspect, Reverend George Kelly. At first glance, the idea that a traveling preacher could be capable of such gruesome violence seemed absurd, even offensive. But as authorities began to piece together his erratic behavior, conflicting statements, and disturbing personal history, Kelly emerged as a suspect who both fascinated and horrified the public. He was the figure who would come to symbolize everything dark and uncertain about the case. George Kelly was a small, wiry man with a nervous disposition and a reputation for eccentric behavior. He had been in Villisca on the night of the murders, having attended the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church where the Moore family was present. In fact, Kelly had been invited to speak at the service and left town by train early the next morning. That timing alone placed him within a very narrow window, one that aligned all too closely with the estimated timeframe of the killings. It wasn't just his proximity to the crime that raised eyebrows. Kelly's personality was marked by instability. He had a history of mental illness and had spent time in various institutions. He was known for his erratic moods, voyeuristic tendencies, and bizarre sexual behavior. In previous towns, he had been accused of writing inappropriate letters to women and girls, and in one case, reportedly spied on women through their windows. These disturbing patterns painted a picture of someone with deep psychological issues, and to some investigators, he seemed like the kind of person capable of committing a crime as perverse and violent as the Axe murders. Kelly also displayed a peculiar obsession with the case. Despite having left Villisca shortly after the murders, he followed the investigation closely and wrote letters to authorities and newspapers expressing his theories. He even returned to the town on several occasions to speak with law enforcement, offering to help solve the mystery. To some, his eagerness to insert himself into the investigation suggested guilt, a classic sign of a killer seeking control or attention. The most damning moment came when Kelly allegedly confessed to the crime, twice. Once in 1917, 5 years after the murders, and again during formal interrogation. However, these confessions were inconsistent, filled with vague details and contradictions. Kelly later recanted, claiming he had been coerced and mentally broken down by relentless questioning. At the time, the use of harsh interrogation tactics was common and rarely documented. It's unclear whether his confession was genuine or the product of exhaustion and manipulation. Despite the questionable nature of the confession, Kelly was arrested and brought to trial in September 1917. The case quickly divided the public. Many believed he was guilty. His erratic behavior, obsession with the case, and the confessions made him seem like a logical suspect. Others viewed the trial as a travesty of justice, accusing law enforcement of targeting a mentally unstable man to satisfy public pressure. His defense attorneys argued that there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime and that his mental state made his confession unreliable. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second resulted in an acquittal. With no forensic evidence to tie him to the crime and growing concern over the integrity of the investigation, the state was forced to let Kelly go. He would never be charged again. Despite the verdict, suspicion clung to George Kelly like a shadow. In the minds of many, the image of the twitchy, wide-eyed preacher never quite faded. For years, his name was spoken in hushed tones, a symbol of the case's moral complexity. Was he a murderer hiding behind the cloth, or a mentally ill man destroyed by public hysteria? The case against Kelly also reflected deeper societal tensions. The idea of a preacher as a killer upended the traditional moral order that small towns clung to. If a man of God could harbor such darkness, then no one was safe, and no one could be trusted. Kelly became more than a suspect. He became a symbol of fear, hypocrisy, and the unsettling truth that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like a man preaching from a pulpit. Even today, opinions remain split. Some modern researchers argue that Kelly was the most likely suspect, pointing to his proximity, psychological profile, and confessions. Others suggest he was a convenient scapegoat, pursued not because of compelling evidence, but because the public needed someone, anyone, to blame. The truth remains as elusive now as it was then. George Kelly's involvement in the Villisca case continues to haunt true crime scholars and historians. His story is a disturbing footnote in a much larger nightmare, a man whose name will forever be linked to a crime so horrific it stopped a town in its tracks and left an entire nation reeling. Whether guilty or not, Kelly embodied the chaotic, unresolved nature of the case, strange, unsettling, and impossible to explain. In the weeks and months following the Villisca Axe murders, the tight-knit town of Villisca, Iowa, began to unravel. What had once been a peaceful, trusting community quickly transformed into a place of suspicion, whispered accusations, and barely concealed fear. The brutality of the crime, combined with the lack of answers, shattered the town's sense of security in ways that would never fully heal. The streets became quieter, the neighbors less friendly, and every shadow seemed to hide a possible killer. The townspeople began locking their doors at night, something many of them had never done before. The idea that someone could creep into a family home and systematically slaughter 8 people, including 6 children, was simply too much to process. That it had happened in a house just like theirs made the terror all the more personal. Homes became fortresses, and trust became a fragile thing. The feeling of invincibility that had once surrounded the town was gone, replaced by a persistent unease that crept into every conversation and every glance exchanged across picket fences. Rumors flourished in the vacuum left by the lack of arrests. With no confirmed suspect, the townspeople turned on each other, looking for signs of guilt in every unusual behavior or nervous gesture. People who had once been pillars of the community found themselves under quiet scrutiny. Hadn't Mr. Dawson acted strangely that morning? Didn't Mrs. Harrow see someone sneaking behind the store late at night? Innocent actions took on new meaning, and reputations were tarnished by nothing more than suspicion. The tension also strained friendships and family ties. Arguments broke out between neighbors who accused one another of withholding information or being too quick to judge. The church, once a place of solace and community, became a tense ground of sideways glances and polite avoidance. Even casual gossip was now weighted with the fear that any careless word might point to the wrong person, or worse, the right one. It was a town eating itself from the inside out. Schoolchildren whispered about the murders at recess, some too young to fully grasp the horror, others old enough to understand just how vulnerable their world had become. Parents struggled to shield their kids from the gruesome details, but rumors spread faster than facts, and children knew more than they were supposed to. Some refused to sleep alone. Others asked questions their parents couldn't answer. The very innocence that the Moore children had once embodied now served as a grim reminder of what had been lost. Businesses suffered as well. Out-of-towners who once passed through Villisca began avoiding it. The story had spread too far, and its notoriety cast a long, dark shadow. The murder house became a macabre curiosity, drawing in reporters, gawkers, and the occasional thrill-seeker. Some townspeople profited from the attention, selling refreshments to the curious, while others were disgusted by the spectacle. Either way, the identity of the town had been irreversibly changed. Villisca was no longer just another Midwestern town, it was the site of a massacre. For law enforcement, the case became a point of frustration and embarrassment. Investigators worked around the clock, but the lack of physical evidence, along with contamination of the crime scene early on, made progress nearly impossible. That failure only deepened the town's mistrust. People began to believe that the authorities were either incompetent or covering something up. Theories emerged that the killer had friends in high places, or that the police knew more than they were admitting. These beliefs festered in the absence of facts, creating a toxic cloud of doubt and resentment. Even in homes untouched by the crime, families couldn't escape the psychological impact. Men began sleeping with weapons nearby. Mothers double-checked locks and windows before bed. The comforting routines of daily life were replaced by a creeping dread. And as the days turned to months, the failure to identify the murderer only made things worse. Every knock on the door felt ominous. Every unexpected sound in the night stirred panic. No one knew if the killer was a stranger who had slipped away into the darkness, or someone still walking among them. Church sermons began to reflect the town's shaken spirit. Ministers spoke of judgment and sin, urging congregants to seek comfort in faith. But even divine reassurance seemed hollow in the face of such monstrous violence. Some questioned their beliefs altogether, struggling to reconcile the notion of a benevolent God with the horror that had unfolded in the Moore home. Religious leaders attempted to restore calm, but even they could not ignore the reality. Something evil had visited Villisca, and it had left behind a wound that refused to close. The longer the case remained unsolved, the deeper the paranoia set in. Some families moved away entirely, unable to bear the weight of constant fear and scrutiny. Others stayed, determined to outlast the nightmare, even as the town's identity crumbled around them. What had once been a community built on shared values and trust had become a fractured landscape of suspicion, sorrow, and silence. Villisca would never be the same. The murders weren't just a tragedy, they were a turning point. The sense of innocence and safety that had defined the town died alongside the Moores and the Stillinger sisters. And in its place, there was only the unbearable knowledge that the world was not as safe, or as simple, as they had believed. As the investigation into the Villisca axe murders dragged on without resolution, investigators and journalists began to notice a chilling pattern. Villisca was not the first, nor the last, town to experience such a brutal and eerily similar massacre. In fact, throughout the early 1900s, a series of axe murders plagued the American Midwest, each marked by certain disturbing commonalities. This discovery opened a grim new theory, that Villisca's tragedy might be the work of a serial killer, traveling by train, choosing homes at random, and vanishing into the night before anyone even knew a crime had occurred. These murders stretched across states, Illinois, Kansas, Colorado, and even as far as Louisiana. In each case, families were killed in their sleep with an axe, often one found at the scene. The weapon would typically be left behind, sometimes partially cleaned, and other times coated in drying blood. Curtains were often drawn or windows covered. Mirrors were shrouded, and in some instances, the victims were covered with clothing or sheets after death. These details were horrifyingly specific and repeated enough times to draw serious suspicion that they were all connected. The idea of a transient killer exploiting the nation's growing but still poorly monitored rail system was more than plausible. In that era, train travel offered an easy means of disappearing. A man could arrive in a town unnoticed, find lodging, observe his intended victims from a distance, and slip away the next morning on the first outbound train. With limited coordination between police departments, especially across state lines, this strategy allowed a murderer to leave behind a bloody scene and face little threat of capture. There was no centralized database, no forensic technology to link crimes across jurisdictions, just rumor and unreliable memory. One of the earliest known crimes that fit this pattern was the 1911 murder of the Burnham family in Colorado Springs. Like Villisca, the family was found bludgeoned to death in their beds. The killer had covered their heads, covered the windows, and used an axe left at the scene. Then came the murders in Monmouth, Illinois, and Ellsworth, Kansas, both families slaughtered in similar ways. Investigators at the time noted the overlapping features, but without fingerprints, DNA, or the benefit of modern profiling, they were limited to gut instinct and guesswork. Some detectives, however, became obsessed with this theory. They began tracking train schedules, mapping the dates and locations of the murders, and searching for witnesses who might have seen the same strange man in multiple towns. A few compelling leads emerged. Some recalled a solitary, disheveled man traveling alone, behaving nervously, or asking odd questions. In one case, a man fitting the description was said to have left town the morning after a murder, catching a train before dawn. But without names or solid identifications, these reports remained frustratingly vague. The potential existence of a serial killer terrified the public even more than the idea of a single, isolated crime. It meant that the horror could return at any time, to any town, with no warning and no rationale. Suddenly, every small railroad town in America feared that it might be next. Citizens pressured their local police to investigate every transient, drifter, or vagrant. Men traveling alone were viewed with suspicion. Strangers were met not with Midwestern hospitality, but with cold eyes and quiet judgments. In 1915, several years after the Villisca murders, a federal investigation was quietly initiated by a few detectives and private investigators who remained convinced of a connection. One name surfaced repeatedly in their discussions: Paul Mueller, a suspected German immigrant believed to have committed a similar axe murder in Massachusetts years earlier and vanished before he could be captured. Some theorized that Mueller had continued killing under the cover of train travel, adopting no fixed identity, leaving behind only blood and unanswered questions. Though compelling, this theory was never conclusively proven. The growing body of similar murders did little to help solve the Villisca case, but it changed how people viewed the crime. No longer was it simply a tragedy unique to Iowa, it was part of a larger, more terrifying story that stretched across the country. And it forced a painful acknowledgement that the forces behind such brutality were not confined to one man, one motive, or even one community. Evil, it seemed, could ride the rails. Despite the tantalizing clues and mounting evidence of a broader pattern, no single person was ever charged in connection to this suspected murder spree. The trail grew cold. Suspects died, disappeared, or were lost to history. Newspaper interest shifted to other stories, and law enforcement, overwhelmed and under-resourced, moved on. But for those who studied the case in depth, the idea of an unseen killer slipping from town to town, leaving only silence and shattered families in his wake, was more horrifying than any singular theory. To this day, the notion of a traveling serial killer remains one of the most compelling and chilling possibilities surrounding the Villisca axe murders. It turns an already disturbing crime into part of a larger nightmare, one that reveals how fragile safety truly was in early 20th century America, and how easily the shadows could stretch from one town to the next. The early morning discovery of the Moore family's murder scene set off a chain of missteps that would severely hinder any chance of solving the Villisca axe murders. What began as a grim curiosity quickly devolved into a spectacle, and the very house that should have been sealed off and preserved as a crime scene became a revolving door for neighbors, onlookers, and even journalists. Before authorities could establish any order, crucial evidence was trampled, touched, and ultimately lost in the chaos. At the time, crime scene protocol was primitive at best. There were no yellow tape barriers, no evidence logs, and certainly no forensic teams in hazmat suits carefully documenting every detail. The concept of contamination wasn't even fully understood. When a concerned neighbor discovered the front door locked and noticed the family's silence, a group of people entered the house to investigate. What they found inside was beyond comprehension. But rather than retreat and alert law enforcement, word spread fast, and soon dozens of townspeople were wandering through the murder site. The Moore home became a house of horror, children's bodies covered in bedclothes, deep gashes cleaved into their heads, blood spattered on walls, ceilings, and personal belongings. And yet, despite the grotesque nature of the scene, there was little attempt to secure it. People stepped over bodies, opened drawers, touched objects out of curiosity, and walked through the rooms with no guidance. Some took objects as souvenirs. Others claimed to see things that no one else could verify. The scene was compromised from the moment it was discovered. This mishandling of the scene wasn't out of malice, it was born from shock, ignorance, and a complete lack of training. The Villisca town marshal, Hank Horton, was not equipped to deal with such a crime. Local doctors and clergy, who were some of the first authority figures on the scene, did their best to control the crowd, but by then, the damage had been done. Blood stains were smeared, potential footprints were destroyed, and the positions of the bodies may have been disturbed. Among the most egregious losses was the failure to preserve potential physical evidence. The killer had left behind the murder weapon, an axe belonging to Josiah Moore, found leaning against a wall in the spare bedroom. Bloodied and still ominously present, the axe should have been a centerpiece of the investigation. But it was not preserved properly. Some reports claim that townspeople even handled it before police took control, wiping away what could have been fingerprints. At a time when fingerprint analysis was still in its infancy, any such evidence would have been fragile, and likely rendered useless. Another significant issue was the handling of the lamp found at the foot of the bed, its chimney removed and the wick turned down low, suggesting someone was attempting to move through the house without attracting attention. Rather than photographing its position or preserving it in situ, it was moved multiple times during the early hours. Other objects, such as a slab of bacon found near the axe and a partially eaten meal left on the kitchen table, were noted but not properly documented. These items may have offered psychological or behavioral clues about the killer, but their relevance was diminished as their context became unclear. The lack of autopsies performed at the crime scene itself also hampered the investigation. Although medical examinations were conducted, they were basic by modern standards. Time of death was estimated using crude observations, and no analysis was done to determine whether the victims had been sedated, poisoned, or otherwise incapacitated before being killed. Any forensic possibilities, such as testing for foreign hair, skin cells, or even fabric, were simply not within the realm of possibility in 1912. But even within the limitations of the time, better scene management could have preserved clues that were instead carelessly discarded. As time went on, inconsistencies and contradictory witness statements began to cloud the timeline. People disagreed about when they last saw the family, what they heard during the night, and who may have been lurking near the house. Had there been a stranger spotted walking the streets? Was someone seen boarding a train early that morning? These reports were valuable, but with the scene already compromised, investigators had no way to corroborate any version of events. The contaminated crime scene became a symbol of lost opportunity. Investigators from outside the town, including private detectives and federal agents, were appalled when they arrived and found the house crawling with people, the evidence disturbed or removed, and no clear control over the investigation. Whatever hope existed of catching the killer quickly began to fade under the weight of these mistakes. In the years following the murders, the mishandling of the scene became a cautionary tale in law enforcement circles. It highlighted the importance of preserving crime scenes, maintaining chains of evidence, and acting with discipline in the face of public panic. Unfortunately for the Moore and Stillinger families, these lessons came too late. The contaminated scene didn't just obscure the identity of the murderer, it allowed that person to vanish. Whether they were a transient, a neighbor, or someone the family knew well, the killer was given a head start. Evidence that might have led to justice was forever buried beneath the footprints of the curious and the well-meaning. Villisca's tragedy became a turning point in the history of criminal investigation, not because it was solved, but because it exposed how easily a case can be lost before it even begins. In the tangled web of speculation surrounding the Villisca axe murders, one name stands out as both compelling and confounding: Reverend George Kelly. A traveling preacher with a troubled past, Kelly was among the earliest to arouse suspicion following the brutal killings. His peculiar behavior, disturbing history, and strange relationship with the town of Villisca made him a central figure in one of America's most puzzling murder investigations, even though, to this day, no conclusive evidence has ever linked him definitively to the crime. Reverend George Kelly arrived in Villisca in June 1912 to participate in the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church, a program organized by the Moore family, who were active church members. The service, held on the evening of June 9, was the last known public event attended by the victims. Kelly, who had been invited to the town to speak, was present at that service and even left town the following morning on a train headed to Macedonia, Iowa. The timeline of his departure, and his behavior afterward, would soon become deeply scrutinized. From the very beginning, George Kelly stood out. Known for his erratic behavior and fragile mental state, he had a history of mental illness and had been committed to a mental hospital at least once prior to 1912. His small stature, high-pitched voice, and obsessive interest in religion made him both an oddity and, to some, a threat. Kelly was prone to bouts of intense paranoia, was easily agitated, and had an unhealthy fascination with young girls, documented in letters and testimonies. These aspects of his personality, while not proof of murder, contributed to the unease many felt in his presence. After the murders, Kelly's behavior grew even more suspicious. He reportedly began writing bizarre letters to authorities and individuals connected to the crime, including detectives and family members of the victims. In these letters, he often inserted himself into the narrative of the crime, speculating with unsettling detail about how the murders were carried out. Some of his observations included information that had not been publicly released at the time. Investigators were disturbed by how fixated he had become on the case, to the point where it appeared he was either inserting himself as a witness or trying to unburden a guilty conscience. The most damning episode came when Kelly allegedly confessed to the crime, twice. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Reverend Kelly was arrested and interrogated for hours. During this intense questioning, Kelly offered a confession stating that he had committed the murders after being overcome by a sudden impulse from God. He claimed divine voices commanded him to slay utterly, a chilling phrase that reflected his deep religious psychosis. However, this confession was quickly retracted, and his defense argued it had been coerced during a time of psychological breakdown and extreme duress. At trial, the prosecution presented Kelly's confession along with testimony highlighting his unstable behavior, past incidents of indecency, and his fascination with the Villisca case. They argued that he had remained in town longer than initially claimed, perhaps hiding in the attic or watching the Moore home before striking. Yet, despite this narrative, the case against him remained circumstantial. There was no physical evidence tying him to the murder weapon, no eyewitness placing him near the home on the night of the murders, and no motive beyond vague spiritual madness. The defense countered effectively, portraying Kelly as a deeply disturbed man prone to fantasy and mental illness, but not violence. His history of exaggeration, his desire for attention, and his intense religious delusions made him an unreliable narrator of his own story. The defense argued that Kelly's confession had been nothing more than the product of mental instability and manipulation by law enforcement. The jury was not convinced of his guilt. After a mistrial in his first trial and a full acquittal in his second, Reverend George Kelly walked free. No one else was ever charged in connection with the murders, and Kelly faded into obscurity. He lived the remainder of his life in relative anonymity, never again facing criminal accusations on this scale. Despite his acquittal, Kelly remains one of the most intriguing figures in the case. His disturbing traits, combined with his uncanny knowledge of the crime, continue to fuel theories that he may have been the killer, or at least knew more than he admitted. Some believe that the mental illness that plagued him also allowed him to operate under the radar, his bizarre behavior providing a kind of unintentional camouflage. Others see him as a scapegoat, targeted because he was strange and socially awkward, but ultimately innocent. To this day, Reverend George Kelly symbolizes both the desperation of the Villisca investigation and the uncertainty surrounding it. His story raises troubling questions about the reliability of confessions, the treatment of mental illness in the justice system, and the lengths to which authorities might go to find closure in a case that offered none. Whether guilty or not, Kelly's name is forever linked to a night of unfathomable violence that continues to haunt a town and a nation over a century later. The Villisca axe murders did not just shatter a single family, it fractured the psyche of an entire town. In the wake of the killings, fear spread faster than any official report. Residents locked their doors for the first time. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. The innocence that had once defined this quiet Iowa community evaporated overnight, replaced by a pervasive dread that would linger for generations. The psychological aftermath of the crime shaped not only local behavior but the very identity of Villisca itself. Before June 10, 1912, Villisca was the epitome of small-town security. Doors were left unlocked, children played freely in the streets, and strangers were often welcomed without question. After the murders, all of that changed. Hardware stores reported a sudden surge in sales of locks, guns, and window bolts. People who once walked to church with neighbors began isolating themselves, keeping curtains drawn and conversations brief. The community was no longer united by trust, but divided by anxiety. Suspicion became a way of life. This transformation wasn't just cultural, it was deeply personal. Families who had once shared Sunday meals now exchanged sideways glances. Fathers slept lightly with guns on their nightstands. Mothers forbade children from staying overnight at friends' homes. Some residents refused to talk about the murders at all, believing that silence might somehow shield them from the horror that had visited the Moore residence. Others became obsessed, poring over newspaper articles, analyzing rumors, and whispering theories in hushed voices. Children were especially affected. Though spared from understanding the full brutality of what had happened, they absorbed the fear radiating from their parents. School teachers noticed changes. Students who had once been cheerful became withdrawn or irritable. Nightmares were common. Some children developed anxieties about sleeping alone, others about the dark or unknown footsteps outside their windows. The idea that something monstrous had entered their world and escaped without consequence rewrote their understanding of safety. Over time, the town's collective trauma began to manifest in unusual ways. Certain houses were rumored to be haunted. Others believed they had seen figures in the night resembling members of the Moore family or the killer himself. Though skeptics dismissed these accounts, they were a symptom of a community trying to make sense of something senseless. Paranormal interpretations became a way to cope, a way to assign meaning or punishment to an act that defied logic. Villisca's reputation, too, began to change. Once known for its vibrant community and strong civic engagement, the town was now associated almost exclusively with death. Journalists from across the country continued to reference the murders in their writing. Books, crime magazines, and later documentaries would revisit the case repeatedly. Though interest in the case brought tourism and economic opportunities in later decades, it also ensured the town's painful history was never fully buried. For every visitor who came to learn about the crime, there was a resident who had to relive the trauma. In the absence of justice, rumors filled the void. Some believed the murderer still lived among them. Others were convinced the killer had been protected by powerful forces, politicians, police, or business interests who didn't want the truth to come out. These theories, often unsupported by evidence, nonetheless took hold because they offered an explanation, any explanation, for how such a horrific act could go unpunished. The inability to find closure left psychological wounds that no amount of time could fully heal. The long-term effects extended beyond the original generation. Children who grew up in the shadow of the murders carried the fear into adulthood. Stories passed down within families ensured that even decades later, the tragedy remained fresh in local memory. Parents warned their own children about the dangers of trusting too easily, venturing out too late, or ignoring signs of strange behavior. For some, the crime became folklore, an enduring cautionary tale. For others, it remained an open wound, raw and unresolved. The house itself became a symbol of this legacy. Though it changed hands multiple times and even sat vacant for periods, its presence loomed large over the town. Some residents avoided the street entirely. Others reported chills, noises, or strange sensations when near it. Over the years, paranormal investigators and curious travelers began to visit, drawn by the dark mystique. While some in Villisca resented the house becoming a spectacle, others accepted it as part of their reality. The house, much like the town, had been permanently transformed. Ultimately, the true horror of the Villisca axe murders lies not just in the brutality of the crime, but in its enduring aftermath. The killer stole more than lives that night. He stole peace of mind, trust in community, and the belief that home was a sanctuary. He left behind a population forever altered, caught between memory and myth, fear and fact. While the names of suspects may fade and theories may shift, the psychological toll remains the one part of the story that everyone in Villisca understands. It's the invisible scar that never healed, a reminder that even the most peaceful places can become the setting for nightmares that never end. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Villisca axe murders, beyond the sheer brutality, was the eerily deliberate behavior of the killer after the act. It wasn't just a rampage fueled by rage or desperation. There was method in the madness, careful choices, quiet details, and bizarre touches that suggested a mind not only capable of murder but steeped in something more sinister. Among the most talked about and puzzling actions of the killer was the way he covered every mirror in the house, as well as all of the glass panes in the doors and windows. To many, this wasn't just strange, it hinted at ritual, belief, or something darker still. The mirrors in the Moore home were all either covered with cloth or dark garments, or turned to face the wall. It was a detail that investigators noted early on but couldn't easily explain. In traditional crime scenes, there is rarely a reason for a killer to interact with mirrors at all. Yet here, in a scene soaked with blood and chaos, the mirrors were purposefully veiled, as if the killer didn't want the reflection of the murders, or perhaps of himself, to remain visible. Some speculated this act was symbolic, a ritualistic gesture rooted in superstition. Others believed it was psychological, a disturbed mind unable to face its own reflection after what had been done. In various cultures and belief systems, the covering of mirrors after death is a ritual intended to protect the soul of the deceased or the living from spiritual harm. In Jewish mourning traditions, for instance, mirrors are covered in a house of mourning to prevent vanity and to avoid reflecting the sorrow of death. Similarly, some cultures believe that a mirror can trap the soul of the departed if left uncovered, leading to restless spirits or misfortune. Whether or not the Villisca killer was consciously observing such customs is unknown, but the deliberate nature of the act suggests a belief, or at least a fear, of what an uncovered mirror might reveal or unleash. Adding to the theory of ritualistic behavior was the placement of the murder weapon and other items found in the home. The bloodied axe, used to slaughter 8 people, was left leaning against the wall in the guest bedroom, partially wiped clean. A 4-pound slab of bacon, wrapped in cloth, was placed nearby. Another slab was found in the icebox. No one has ever definitively explained why raw meat was positioned near the crime scene. Some believe it was symbolic. Others suggest it may have been used as part of a deranged ceremony or perhaps intended to mislead investigators. These strange touches led many to speculate that the killer wasn't just a madman, but possibly someone engaged in dark practices. Was this an act of occult violence? A sacrifice of some kind? The alignment of the murders with a Sunday church service and the killer's apparent patience, waiting inside or nearby until the family was asleep, led to theories that the timing itself was intentional. Was the Sabbath significant to the killer? Was the act meant as a form of punishment or purification? Psychiatrists who studied the case years later proposed that the covering of mirrors and bodies might indicate dissociation or remorse. To cover a mirror could mean avoiding the psychological horror of self-awareness during or after a violent act. Covering the victims' heads with clothing or bedsheets, as the killer did with each one, could be a way of separating the killer's mind from the reality of what had been done, removing the humanity of the victims so he could continue the slaughter without emotional interruption. These actions, whether rooted in belief or psychological unraveling, added a terrifying complexity to the killer's profile. Then there were the candles. Though not always consistently mentioned, some witness accounts noted the possible presence of candles lit or left near the beds, again suggesting a ritualistic ambience. The chimney of a lamp had been removed and the flame turned low, creating a dim, deliberate environment for murder. This wasn't an act committed in a frenzy. It was done with eerie control and silence, despite the presence of 6 children in the home. No neighbors reported screams or cries. The killer either drugged the victims, killed them before they could awaken, or muffled their sounds with calculated precision. The idea that someone could execute such a massacre without alerting anyone, and then spend time covering mirrors, draping cloths, repositioning food, and wiping down the weapon, was nearly beyond comprehension. It painted the picture not of panic or fear, but of intent. Theories abound about who the killer was, ranging from deranged religious figures to transient cult members, but these ideas are supported more by the ritualistic nature of the scene than by solid evidence. The symbolism, though chilling, has never been fully deciphered. Whether the killer believed he was performing a rite, silencing spirits, or simply spiraling through his own delusions, one thing is certain: the Villisca murders were not merely violent, they were ritualized. And in that ritual, the killer may have revealed more about his mind than any confession ever could. The covered mirrors reflected a deep-rooted fear of spiritual consequence or perhaps a symbolic rejection of the killer's own identity. In trying to hide his reflection, he may have inadvertently offered one to the world, a dark, fractured glimpse into the soul of someone who didn't just kill but wanted to erase the world's ability to see him do it. As investigators exhausted local leads and suspects, attention slowly shifted to a broader possibility, one that would haunt both detectives and true crime enthusiasts for decades: the theory that the Villisca axe murderer was a drifter, a transient moving along the Midwestern Railroad lines, striking victims at random and vanishing before dawn. This wasn't a baseless hunch born of desperation. It was a theory grounded in timing, logistics, and a deeply disturbing pattern that suggested Villisca was not the only town where an entire family was annihilated in their sleep with a blunt-edged weapon. The heart of this theory lies in Villisca's train schedule. The murder occurred sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. on June 10, 1912. The killer had ample time to slip away before the family was discovered later that morning. Crucially, a westbound train departed the Villisca depot at 5:19 a.m., just enough time for the murderer to leave the scene, clean up slightly, and board the train out of town unnoticed. This single detail offered a chilling plausibility. The killer may have committed the crime with the clock in mind, timed his departure with near-military precision, and disappeared into the American heartland without a trace. At the time, the Midwest was laced with rail lines. Small towns like Villisca thrived along these tracks, and hobos, transients, and traveling salesmen regularly rode the rails. The open access to transportation created a unique vulnerability: strangers could enter a town under cover of darkness and be gone by morning. Law enforcement was far less centralized than it is today, and communication between jurisdictions was slow and often disorganized. This disjointed system provided the perfect environment for a roaming killer. What makes the drifter theory even more compelling is the disturbing number of eerily similar crimes reported in the months and years surrounding the Villisca murders. Entire families murdered in their sleep. The weapon was usually an axe, sometimes belonging to the victims themselves. The killer often left the axe behind. Windows were covered. Mirrors, in some cases, were turned or draped. Sometimes a chimney lamp was lowered to reduce light. Entry was usually through a back door or an unlocked window. And, like in Villisca, nothing was taken, no robbery, no sexual assault, no ransom. Just cold, calculated slaughter. These similar murders occurred in places like Colorado Springs, Ellsworth, Kansas, Monmouth, Illinois, and Paola, Kansas. Each scene shared haunting consistencies, enough so that federal investigators and regional law enforcement began to wonder, were these the work of a single serial killer before the term even existed in the public lexicon? The most notable cluster occurred in Colorado Springs in the fall of 1911, less than a year before Villisca. 2 families were murdered in separate incidents, both with axes. In both cases, the killer covered mirrors and windows. Authorities at the time suspected the same person may have been responsible for both crimes, and eventually, those suspicions expanded to include the Villisca murders. The similarities were simply too specific to ignore. Adding to the horror of this theory is the idea that the killer may have been motivated not by rage or personal vendetta, but by compulsion. A mind possibly warped by trauma, psychosis, or religious delusion, targeting families in quiet homes for no reason other than opportunity and ritual. The axe was always present, often owned by the victims themselves, stored in barns or woodpiles, easy to access in rural America. The killer never brought the weapon. He didn't need to. The towns provided everything. The transient killer theory was later picked up by federal investigator Matthew McClawtrey, who compiled and studied a series of similar axe murders across state lines. His analysis drew disturbing connections, suggesting that the same man could have been responsible for as many as 20 unsolved family slayings between 1911 and 1914. However, without forensic tools like DNA analysis or fingerprint databases, solid confirmation was impossible. These were crimes committed in a different era, when blood was cleaned with rags, suspects were questioned without recordings, and evidence was often destroyed by curious townsfolk before police arrived. The notion of a faceless killer slipping between towns, hiding in plain sight, riding the trains by night and murdering families by moonlight, became part of the case's grim mythology. It terrified residents not just of Villisca, but of small towns across the Midwest. If true, the implications were staggering. The killer wasn't someone known to the Moore family. He wasn't Reverend Kelly or a jealous business rival. He was a ghost on the rails, blending in with the faceless mass of itinerants, and choosing his victims based on geography and silence. This theory, while never officially proven, remains one of the most widely believed explanations for the Villisca murders. It offers a chilling resolution, not in justice, but in understanding. The killer may have never been caught because he was never there long enough to be known. He may have murdered, stepped onto a train, and vanished into the folds of America's forgotten backroads, leaving behind nothing but questions and 8 lifeless bodies. In the end, the idea of a drifter killer is not only plausible, it's terrifying. It speaks to a kind of evil that doesn't require motive or identity. One that exists only in the shadows, on the edge of a timetable, and in the quiet hours when the world is asleep. While the Moore family bore the weight of most headlines following the Villisca axe murders, the presence of the 2 young guests, Ina Mae Stillinger, age 8, and her sister Lena Gertrude Stillinger, age 12, adds a heartbreaking layer to the already devastating tragedy. Their deaths were not incidental. They were not collateral. They were deliberate, and their involvement in the massacre made the crime even more senseless and haunting. To understand the full magnitude of what happened that night, it's important to examine how the Stillinger girls came to be in that house, and what their deaths represented to the grieving community. The Stillinger sisters were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, farmers who lived on the outskirts of Villisca. They were well-liked, active in their church, and deeply connected within the local community. On the evening of June 9, 1912, the Moore family attended a Children's Day program at the local Presbyterian church. Lena and Ina, who had also participated in the program, were invited by their friend Catherine Moore to spend the night at the Moore residence, a spontaneous decision, and one that tragically sealed their fate. Sarah Stillinger had agreed, expecting her daughters to return the following morning. This simple, everyday arrangement, 2 girls sleeping over at a trusted friend's home, was a common occurrence in tight-knit towns like Villisca. No one could have anticipated that this particular night would become the final chapter in their young lives. The girls slept in the guest bedroom on the main floor, directly across from the parlor. It is believed that Lena was the last to die. Her body was found partially dislodged from the bed, suggesting she may have woken during the attack and attempted to fight back or escape. Ina, in contrast, was likely killed in her sleep. The Stillinger family was devastated. Their daughters had not just died, they had been murdered violently and without cause in someone else's home, a place they had been sent with trust and love. The emotional wreckage extended beyond grief. The mother, Sarah Stillinger, reportedly fainted when she arrived at the Moore house and learned what had happened. The anguish was unimaginable. They had allowed their children to participate in a joyful community event. They had agreed to what should have been a safe, innocent sleepover. Instead, they were left to bury both daughters side by side. The community response to the Stillinger family's loss was profound. While the Moore family was the primary focus of national headlines, those who lived in Villisca grieved just as deeply for Lena and Ina. Their deaths underscored the randomness and cruelty of the killer's actions. These were not targets. These were children who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That fact magnified the collective horror and guilt that consumed the town. No one was safe. Even a simple overnight stay could end in brutality. In the years that followed, the Stillingers lived in the shadow of a tragedy that was not theirs to control but was forever linked to their name. There were whispers, theories, and unwanted attention. Some questioned whether the girls had seen something or known something, but no evidence ever pointed to a motive. Their presence was incidental in the most tragic sense. Yet, the brutality they suffered was indistinguishable from the rest. The killer showed no mercy. If anything, the evidence suggests a particularly brutal force was used in the guest room, possibly out of rage or haste. Lena's injuries, in particular, raised disturbing questions. Her body was found with her nightgown pushed up and her undergarments removed, though investigators at the time insisted there was no definitive evidence of sexual assault. Even so, the positioning of the body led some to believe the killer may have had a twisted motive or at least a deep perversion guiding his violence. The image of a 12-year-old girl being potentially victimized in such a way shook the town's moral core. In a time where such topics were rarely spoken of openly, the implications were whispered but never forgotten. The funeral for Lena and Ina was held shortly after the Moore families. Their white caskets, small and delicate, were laid to rest in the Villisca Cemetery, not far from the Moore children. The service was attended by hundreds, including classmates, church members, and townsfolk who had once admired the Stillinger girls' kindness and energy. It was one of the few moments when the community came together in unity after the murders, a shared grief so intense that it briefly overcame the fear and suspicion. In historical accounts, the Stillingers are often mentioned as an afterthought, the two guests, the friends of the Moore children, but their story is no less central. They represent the purest loss in the narrative, children who had no connection to any feud, rivalry, or possible motive. Their presence underscores the indiscriminate nature of the killer's violence. If there was any doubt that the crime was the work of a deeply disturbed individual or someone entirely devoid of empathy, the fate of the Stillinger girls obliterated it. To this day, visitors to the Villisca Axe murder house often leave small flowers or toys near the spot where the girls were believed to have slept. Their story, while simple in structure, is among the most powerful reminders of what was taken that night. Not just lives, but innocence. Not just a family, but the very sense of safety and order that once defined a small American town. Lena and Ina Stillinger were supposed to enjoy a fun evening with friends. Instead, they became symbols of unthinkable tragedy, and their memory lingers like a ghost that Villisca will never be able to forget. In the weeks following the Villisca Axe murders, the town underwent a transformation that no one had anticipated, one driven not just by grief but by paranoia, suspicion, and a quiet unraveling of community trust. The horror of the event was matched only by the confusion and helplessness that followed. For a place as small and intimate as Villisca, Iowa, where neighbors helped raise each other's barns and families left doors unlocked at night, the very fabric of daily life began to tear apart. The brutal murder of 8 people, 6 of them children, left a psychic scar, and in that wound festered an epidemic of fear. At the heart of the unease was one terrible truth: no one knew who the killer was. And that absence of a culprit became more terrifying than any single suspect. Residents were gripped by the dread that the murderer was not some stranger who'd ridden into town and vanished. Many feared he was still among them, walking the streets, smiling at shopkeepers, tipping his hat in church pews. Everyone became a suspect. Neighbors began to eye each other with guarded skepticism. Families who had shared Sunday dinners started to keep their distance. Trust, the essential currency of small-town life, collapsed almost overnight. Authorities quickly realized that the community was on edge, and they tried to restore order. Local and state investigators conducted interviews, questioned witnesses, and searched for any overlooked evidence. But every step forward seemed to birth two more unanswered questions. The lack of a clear motive or forensic trace created a void into which wild theories, rumors, and false accusations poured in. It wasn't long before whispers of guilt and secrets turned into public accusations. One of the most tragic consequences of this paranoia was the way it damaged reputations and relationships. A local man could find himself suddenly the target of gossip for something as simple as having been out walking at night or owning a similar pair of boots as the killer might have worn. The Reverend George Kelly, who was eventually tried and acquitted for the murders, was one of several individuals caught in this whirlwind of suspicion. But there were others, neighbors, relatives, even law enforcement, who found themselves questioned not because of evidence, but because of fear-fueled speculation. The newspapers didn't help. While some publications tried to report responsibly, many papers sensationalized the murders, giving rise to increasingly lurid theories. Headlines screamed of satanic rituals, vengeful spirits, or shadowy cults. These stories sold copies, but they also further agitated a town desperate for answers. The more outrageous the headlines, the more residents began to believe that something truly monstrous had visited their quiet homes, and might return at any moment. The children were the most visibly affected. School teachers reported a sharp decline in attendance in the weeks after the murders. Parents kept their children close, afraid to let them out of their sight. Sleepovers and late-night church events were canceled. It wasn't just about grief, it was about survival. Families purchased locks for the first time. Some even bought firearms. Homes that had once been sanctuaries became fortresses. In Villisca, the night became something to fear, not to rest in. Psychologically, the town entered a prolonged state of collective trauma. There were no counselors or grief therapists in 1912. There was no structured system to process the kind of horror that had descended upon the community. People simply carried it inside them, some repressing it, others expressing it through sudden outbursts or isolation. Anxiety became a constant presence. Some residents reported hearing footsteps at night or seeing figures outside their windows. While many of these experiences were likely the result of heightened fear and imagination, they were deeply real to those who lived through them. Churches attempted to offer solace, but even there, the safety felt fragile. Ministers preached about God's will, the presence of evil, and the testing of faith, yet many parishioners found those words hollow in the wake of such senseless violence. The fact that the murders had taken place after a church program only deepened the spiritual confusion. If goodness, innocence, and faith could not protect them, what could? As months passed and the case remained unsolved, some families moved away from Villisca altogether, unable to reconcile their lives with the haunting reality that justice had not, and might never, come. Businesses suffered. Tourism evaporated. The name Villisca became synonymous not with the rolling fields and friendly neighbors it had once boasted, but with something darker. For decades, outsiders would recognize the name only in the context of murder. What happened in Villisca didn't just destroy one family. It didn't just claim 8 lives. It disrupted the very ecosystem of small-town America. It replaced certainty with doubt, warmth with cold suspicion, and community with isolation. This wasn't just a murder mystery, it was a social contagion, infecting the minds of everyone who lived there and transforming a peaceful town into a place haunted not only by what had happened but by what it might happen again. And so, long after the bodies were buried and the investigations grew cold, the true legacy of the Villisca axe murders was left not just in blood-stained walls, but in the frayed connections between neighbors, the mistrust in every handshake, and the deep-seated fear that evil doesn't always come from outside, it might be living next door. Long after the Villisca axe murders faded from the front pages, something unnatural seemed to linger within the walls of the White House at 508 East 2nd Street. As the decades passed and generations came and went, the town of Villisca attempted to resume a semblance of normalcy, but the home where the Moore family and the Stillinger girls were murdered never quite settled. Some claimed it refused to. The very air surrounding the structure was described as heavy, and those who passed by it often crossed to the other side of the street, even in broad daylight. When the murders remained unsolved, closure became an impossible goal. For the residents, grief slowly transformed into curiosity, and curiosity often paved the way to folklore. But unlike most urban legends, this one was rooted in something very real. The unspeakable violence, the lack of justice, and the disruption of a peaceful family home created a breeding ground for the supernatural. In time, the Moore house came to be viewed not just as the scene of a crime, but as something cursed. Some believed it to be a portal, where the spiritual residue of violence had left a permanent scar. By the mid-20th century, stories of paranormal activity began to circulate more publicly. Former residents, short-term renters, and later paranormal investigators described a wide range of unexplainable events. Some claimed to hear children's laughter echoing through empty rooms. Others reported hearing heavy footsteps moving through the upstairs hallway, always at night, despite no one being in the home. Objects were said to move on their own. Lights flickered. Doors opened and closed without explanation. The most chilling accounts involved disembodied voices and whispers, often calling out the names of the deceased children. Visitors to the home began to report feeling a physical presence. Some described sensations of being watched closely, of hands brushing against their skin when no one was near. The basement, in particular, became a focal point of these reports. A sense of dread seemed to hang there persistently, and those who spent more than a few minutes below ground often emerged pale, shaken, or nauseated. Paranormal researchers, both amateur and professional, began flocking to the house in search of answers, and some left with disturbing recordings and equipment malfunctions they could not explain. Despite being vacant for long stretches, the home's reputation grew. It became something more than a crime scene. It became a destination. Not for tourists in the traditional sense, but for those drawn to the unexplained. The house was eventually restored to resemble its 1912 appearance: no running water, no electricity, just the way it was the night of the murders. That authenticity only deepened the discomfort felt by those who visited. People began to treat the house as a spiritual artifact, a shrine to unresolved death and restless energy. One of the most widely reported incidents involved guests staying overnight as part of a paranormal tour. Multiple visitors woke at the same time, shortly after 2 a.m., the approximate time of the murders, and each reported hearing a loud thud from the attic, followed by the sound of someone dragging an object across the floor. No one had been in the attic. Others claimed to have seen apparitions of small children, often around corners or standing at the foot of beds, only to vanish the moment attention was drawn to them. Critics of the paranormal aspect argue that these claims are driven more by expectation and suggestion than actual phenomena. They point to the human mind's vulnerability to fear, especially in dark, quiet, isolated settings with a known history of violence. Skeptics cite pareidolia, sleep paralysis, and group hysteria as more likely causes. But even among non-believers, few deny that the house possesses a deeply unsettling energy. Whether psychological or supernatural, something about the Moore home resists peace. The notion of a haunting, while unsettling, offers a strange form of justice to some. If the killer was never caught, perhaps the spirits of the victims refuse to leave until the truth is revealed. That belief, while unprovable, offers a narrative closure that the official investigation never could. For others, the idea that the house is cursed or haunted feels like a metaphor brought to life, a visual, experiential manifestation of guilt, fear, and unresolved trauma. The murders were so brutal, and the community fallout so profound, that it's no surprise people believe the house holds on to what the town tried so hard to forget. In modern times, the Villisca Axe Murder House is now a place people willingly enter, often paying for the privilege to do so. Paranormal shows, documentaries, and ghost hunters have all walked its narrow hallways, hoping to catch a flicker of something beyond explanation. Some leave disappointed. Others leave convinced they brushed against something cold, ancient, and very much alive in the aftershock of death. The house has become a character in its own story, silent, stoic, and pulsing with questions. What remains most disturbing is not necessarily the ghost stories, but the reason they exist at all. The haunting is not simply about a family lost or children murdered. It's about how pain can anchor itself to a place, how unanswered questions echo louder with time, and how when justice is denied, some believe the dead will make themselves heard, one whisper, one creaking floorboard, one chilling night at a time. Over a century has passed since the axe murders in Villisca, Iowa, but the story has not faded into silence. It endures, etched into the annals of true crime history, whispered about in the dark corners of the internet, studied by criminal profilers, and relived by paranormal seekers. Despite all efforts to distance time from trauma, the Villisca murders continue to provoke questions, ignite theories, and draw curious minds into a web of violence, mystery, and human fear that refuses to unravel. What happened in that modest White House was not just a crime, it became a benchmark of terror, a blueprint for the unknown. The murder of 8 people, 6 of them children, in their own beds, with no clear motive and no definitive killer, leaves a wound that resists healing. It confronts our deepest need for closure. In every other aspect of life, time moves forward and answers are eventually found. But Villisca stands still, locked in a night of unimaginable horror. The unsolved nature of the case elevates its legacy to something far beyond a historical tragedy. It becomes mythic, unsettling, and eternal. To this day, there are dozens of theories about who committed the murders. Some believe it was a transient drifter passing through, someone who hopped trains and killed without leaving a trace. Others argue it had to be someone local, familiar with the house, the family, and the rhythms of the town. The Reverend George Kelly, the mentally unstable minister who was eventually tried for the murders, remains one of the most divisive figures in the story. His confession, later recanted, and his subsequent acquittal left even more ambiguity. Was he a scapegoat, a madman drawn into the chaos, or the killer himself, able to manipulate the fragile justice system of the time? Every few years, new researchers emerge with fresh takes on old evidence. They examine timelines, analyze photographs, re-interview descendants, and comb through dusty archives. Books continue to be written. Podcasts revisit the case with fervent speculation. Television specials are produced with dramatized reenactments, shadowy lighting, and ominous music, inviting viewers to play detective from the safety of their living rooms. But despite all of this attention, the truth remains maddeningly elusive. One of the most haunting aspects of the Villisca legacy is its influence on the American psyche. Long before the term serial killer entered the public lexicon, the Villisca case showcased the terror of senseless, methodical murder. It represented the moment when the illusion of rural innocence shattered. In a place where children once played freely and doors remained unlocked, the notion of safety dissolved overnight. That rupture reverberated beyond Iowa, becoming a cautionary tale whispered across generations. Schools in the region began using the story as a macabre local history lesson, less about the facts, more about the fear. Children grew up hearing warnings not just about strangers, but about the possibility of evil hiding in plain sight. For decades, the town itself bore a kind of shame, as if the unresolved crime had stained its soil. Residents were often hesitant to talk about it, afraid of being seen as sensationalists, or worse, as profiting from tragedy. But as time went on, the narrative evolved from avoidance to remembrance, and finally, to exploration. In recent years, Villisca has found itself at a strange intersection, between historical preservation and paranormal tourism. The Moore home, meticulously restored to reflect the 1912 setting, now serves both as a museum and as a haunting experience. Some come to honor the victims, others to hunt ghosts. But regardless of the reason, each visitor steps into a space that feels suspended between past and present, grief and curiosity, silence and whispers. The walls themselves seem to breathe with memory. The broader legacy of the Villisca murders isn't just about a single night of brutality. It's about the questions it forces society to ask, about the nature of evil, the fragility of justice, and the permanence of trauma. It's about how communities respond to the incomprehensible, and how stories shape identities, even when they're filled with darkness. It's about the impact of the unknown and how fear endures when no resolution comes. Perhaps what makes the Villisca axe murders so deeply disturbing is not the gore or the ghost stories, it's the vacancy where answers should be. The empty chair at the dinner table. The unanswered cry in the night. The face that never appears in the crowd. In this void, fear thrives. In this silence, imaginations run wild. And as long as those questions remain, the story of Villisca will continue to haunt not just the house or the town, but anyone who dares to peer into the darkness and ask, what really happened that night? Because in Villisca, the lights may go out, the visitors may leave, and the years may pass, but the murders, the mystery, and the madness still remain, waiting in the shadows, undisturbed by time. If you're still awake, thank you for joining us tonight. But remember, some crimes never rest. Some souls never sleep. And some houses never let go. This has been Mr. DarXnights. Subscribe for more haunting stories, real nightmares, and forgotten horrors. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.